Welcome to this latest episode of the Law's Two Bodies series. The title and the inspiration for the project comes from Sir John Baker's book of the same title. Central to the book is the argument that the common law is, and I quote, almost universally regarded as a system of case law, increasingly supplemented by legislation, but that is only partly true. There is an extensive body of lawyers' law, which has a real existence outside the formal sources, but is seldom acknowledged or discussed either by legal theorists or legal historians. The project asks the question, what is law? But pursues its answer in a fashion different from typical jurisprudential investigations. It examines what legal practitioners do, how they regard law, to what extent they think about law in the abstract. The approach is ethnographic rather than philosophical or sociological. The aim is to build up a corpus of interviews with a variety of legal practitioners and others involved with law, concentrating on the issues outlined above. The interviews will involve a set of questions posed to all interviewees, and then further questions arising from the initial answers or appropriate to each interviewee. At present, the purpose is to stimulate thought rather than produce any publication. The aim is to create a set of interesting case studies rather than a carefully representative sample of practitioners. And today we diverge in two ways from what we've done in the past. One is we have here someone who is both legal academic, but also very much involved in legal practice. And secondly, we move into a different area of geography because we have a specialist in space law. Today I have with me Professor Michael Byers, who holds the Canada Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law at the University of British Columbia. He's also a St Andrews Senior Global Fellow for the 2021-22 academic year. So Michael, tell us a little bit about your career and the various things that you do.
In 30 seconds? First of all, it's great to be here. Thank you. And thank you to the students who've come here as well today during a busy time of the semester. I literally will give you the short version. I'm trained both as a political scientist and as a lawyer. And it may also be interesting to know that I'm trained both in the common law and the civil law, which happened at McGill University, and I thought was particularly helpful in understanding international law, which of course draws upon a wide range of domestic legal traditions. And I am what is called a general international lawyer.
Right.
So I can comfortably move between human rights and international trade and the law of the sea and outer space law, because the fundamentals of those different subfields are common across the general field. And from time to time I change my focus and work on a new area because I see it becoming more important in world politics. So for a number of years I worked on the laws of war. I then became involved with climate change and the Arctic, and now I'm working on outer space. And part of what I try to do is anticipate what the next big thing is going to be, partly because, like all academics, I want to be working on the hot issues, but also because that's where I feel I can make the most difference. And this is, I think, the crucial point, is I'm an activist academic. And when you say I'm a legal practitioner, most people wouldn't think so because I don't practice in front of courts. In fact, I'm not a member of any bar or law society. I'm not qualified to practice in front of courts. But what I do is certainly legal practice in the sense that I deploy my legal expertise on issues that require political decision making and try to influence the course of that decision making, either through taking public positions in the media, I write a lot of essays in newspapers, but also speaking directly to senior civil servants, to elected politicians, and trying to figure out how to maximize influence as someone who doesn't have power in any traditional sense, but has the power of ideas. And I find this to be satisfying in the sense that I feel that from time to time I can make a difference. And it also means that I really don't know what I'm going to be working on until I get up in the morning and turn on the radio.
Right.
It's cutting edge stuff in many cases. And so I, having spent a good part of my early career buried in university libraries, I feel like I've climbed out of the library a bit and I'm engaged in real life.
That's what I was going to move on and ask you. What's the time split between, in a sense, traditional academic work and activism, or is it impossible to make the split given where the subjects you're working on now?
There is no split. So my two most recent academic publications were both in Nature journals, so Nature Scientific Reports and Nature Astronomy. So I'm actually engaged with a colleague who's an astrophysicist as we try to spot upcoming issues. And in the first of these, one of the things we draw into the attention of hopefully governments is that there's a very high potential climate impact from the re-entering of the thousands of satellites that are being launched into low Earth orbit right now. So when you have a satellite coming back into atmospheric re-entry, people say they burn up. But of course mass doesn't disappear. So these aluminum satellites are turning into literally billions of tiny particles of aluminum, which could potentially reflect a lot of solar energy back into space. This could be a form of geoengineering, but no one has studied it, no one has modeled it, no one has approved it. This is mostly Elon Musk just doing it on his own. So we're able to raise that issue. And today I actually went for a walk with someone who's involved with a leading environmental organization and explained to her this new issue. And to get that community realizing that no matter how much we do about carbon dioxide emissions here on Earth, we also need to be paying attention to what we're doing to the upper atmosphere by the things that come back to Earth through it. The other issue is the issue of the practice of abandoning these big rocket stages in orbit after we use them to launch satellites. And there are roughly now 2,000 of these, some of them weighing up to 10 tons, in these elliptical orbits. And they're coming back. And because I'm working with an astrophysicist, we've been able to identify that these rockets, which are launched by powerful countries in the global north, come down disproportionately, or will come down disproportionately, on the global south. And if you imagine what 10 tons of steel and titanium would do if it struck a megacity in the global south, right? These are what are called low-risk, high-consequence events. It's statistically unlikely that it's going to happen this year or in the next 10 years, but at some point it will happen, and when it happens, it will be extraordinarily bad. And this is a global equity issue. And it's not really all that different from how we externalize the consequences of greenhouse gas production. We benefit in the north industrially, and the consequences are felt most heavily in the global south as entire Pacific Island countries start to disappear. And again, that issue that equity issue has not been highlighted by anyone before. And I'm not just going to leave that article, in Nature Astronomy. I'm going to send that article to every single foreign ministry in the global south, and I'm going to make sure that people in governments are reading this. Because here's the real kicker, is that in 2022 we have the technology to ensure that every rocket stage that we use now comes back in a controlled manner and lands in the middle of an ocean. But we're not doing that because it would cost more money. So you can actually have pressure from the global south, from civil society, to get these northern rich countries and their companies to spend a little bit more money to do this safely. But of course they won't do it unless we make this a public issue. So those are just the two things I'm working on right now. So it is activism, and that I'm trying to change the world slightly, if I can, in a better way. But I'm doing it by partnering with a leading astrophysicist, by learning an awful lot, by doing what I think is pretty difficult, at least for me, interdisciplinary work, and then trying to figure out ways to get that into places, into discussions where people will respond. And is it law? Absolutely it's law. These papers are I'm doing analysis of space treaties and customary international law that would be very familiar to anyone who practices in international courts or tribunals.
You obviously have a law degree in your background. How do you keep up with law now, given that you're also keeping up with astrophysics and so on? Where do you get your information from?
I was taught law at McGill University, and I remember our dean at the time, Rod MacDonald, saying at one point that we don't teach our students what the law is, we teach them how to find it when they need it and to put the law to use. So my legal research skills are just as good as they were 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So when a problem arises, I just need to identify that it's a problem, and then I'll roll up my sleeves and do hard legal research. And that's the same with anything I encounter, right? I discovered that there's a problem with rocket bodies in low Earth orbit, and I sit down with my astrophysicist colleague and say, Aaron, could you teach me the physics I need to know so that we can write about this? And he laughs. He says I'm a bit of a slow learner, because usually you teach physics to teenagers, not to 55-year-olds. But it's not. I don't walk around with an encyclopedia of knowledge in my mind. I walk around with tools, with a skill set, and with the determination to teach myself what I need to know, or to get other smart experts to teach me the minimal knowledge that I need.
Presumably the transformation since you were doing it 30 years ago is that it's now very largely done online.
Yeah, and so I can live on a small island off the west coast of Canada and have the same access that I would have living beside a world-class university library for almost everything. Now, some of my work from time to time involves legal history. So researching the events and the discussions that led up to the creation of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in 1958 is not something I can do online. One of the advantages of being a senior academic is that if you need to go to a good library somewhere and find those negotiating documents, well, that's what research grants are for. And I do like going back to the dusty old books when I can. But again, it's these are just challenges to overcome, right? The skill set, and I think the most important skill set is knowing when you have a problem, right? Identifying that you have a problem, or identifying that you've made an assumption that needs to be tested. That's the other thing, is that we assume so much, right? Because we take shortcuts. We have to. As human beings, as intellectuals, we take all kinds of shortcuts. And sometimes those shortcuts, those assumptions are blind spots, and we miss the really important stuff. So sometimes the most important thing is just, thinking things through and mulling things over. I'm a sea kayaker. I go out on the Pacific Ocean near where I live for a day at a time sometimes, and my most important insights come when I'm out on the water, right? Sometimes my colleagues joke that I'm taking time off. I'm not taking time off. I'm solving a problem, or I'm identifying the questions that I need to then go solve. So I think again the point here is that if you've completely sort of internalized the intellectual process, it's happening all the time. It happens when you're sleeping, right? You're working. The human brain is this wonderfully complex machine that surprises us sometimes, and I like throwing my mind into new problems.
One of the things that this project revolves around is the idea that was put across by Baker that the legal world was very small in terms of people, and it was a shared knowledge amongst them. And what we're tending to find is that that is no longer true of the legal world as a whole, but within specific areas of this remains true. It's my assumption that people working on law relating to outer space, it's a fairly small group, and that there is what they know to some extent. It's part of space law rather than being about space law, if you see the distinction.
Yeah. I don't consider myself part of that group that works on space law, because I'm a general international lawyer who's now working on issues of space.
Right.
And this is what Oscar Schachter, professor of international law at Columbia University, once called the invisible college of international lawyers.
Yeah, exactly.
And when he wrote that, probably 40 years ago, it would have been 100 people. And obviously it's made up of many more. And there are people who aren't really part of it because they're so intensely specialized that they only do international trade, or they only do international intellectual property, or they only do, climate change negotiation. But there are still generalists. And where I find the best generalists actually are in national governments, in foreign ministries. Or to give you an example, I have two colleagues who now work at NASA, but who came to NASA from the U.S. State Department. And these two individuals, who are probably in their 40s, are among the best general international lawyers I've ever met. Now, just to understand this, the United States State Department has 700 international lawyers.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know how many the Foreign Office has in London, but not 700, but certainly quite a few. And the ability to stay on top of issues, to participate in every single diplomatic negotiation, to intervene at every possible opportunity is an exercise of power by these larger, well-resourced countries. But it also means that there are people who I can talk about in these governments who share my same knowledge. I don't need to explain to them, what the different criteria for doing a treaty interpretation under the 1969 Vienna Convention, what those criteria are. They know that, right? I don't. We can have a very wide-ranging conversation in a short period of time because we have such a large shared language and knowledge base. So I think that's what you're talking about. And it also means that, if I notice something that that the United States is doing with regards to a space policy that I would question, I can phone one of these people up and say, what about Article 5? And they know instantly what I'm talking about, right? And they might then say, yeah, we know that, and we're doing something about it, right? And maybe in my small optimistic world, they then tell their boss that they've had inquiries and they better do something about it. Right. So there is this world, and the world extends to the foreign ministry in Beijing or in Moscow, which, despite the very serious current problems, still has very good international lawyers putting forward really weak arguments at the moment with regards to Ukraine because they don't have anything better.
Yeah.
But it is an invisible college, and it is global, and it does matter. And governments don't always follow the law, but at least they pay some reputational price when they choose not to.
You mentioned that you got legal training in civil and common law, and that clearly is pragmatically and practically necessary to you. Are you interested in differences between legal systems more in the abstract, or in law more in the abstract, or is it practical for your various purposes?
So one of the things I've spent time on in the last 6 months is the duty to rescue, which a domestic lawyer might recognize as the Good Samaritan principle. And one can find many instances of it in international treaties, things like the Convention on Safety of Law at Sea, Convention on Safety of Lives at Sea, which not coincidentally was adopted 2 years after the Titanic sank. And you can trace it through the Chicago Convention on Civil Aviation and all the way through to the present day in international treaties. But if you're analyzing whether or not the duty applies as a rule of customary international law, binding all countries, applying everywhere, you need to go further. And one of the places you go is to domestic legal systems to see if it's present as a general principle. So you go to the French Civil Code. Of course it's there, right? Yeah. And then you find out that the state of Vermont adopted it as state legislation in the United States, and that other states in the United States, they don't have a duty to rescue, but they indemnify. They give a waiver of liability to anyone who causes harm while trying to rescue someone. And so I basically did a broad-based comparative law search looking at this to find, to determine whether or not it was widespread as part of analyzing the international domain. I feel fortunate in that as a Canadian public lawyer, I read French, and also doubly fortunate in that my mother spoke German to me for my first 5 years.
Right.
She is an immigrant from Germany to Canada, and I was able to get my German back by spending a number of summers at a Max Planck Institute in Germany. So I can do this research, at least in the Western European world. Yeah. And that just is sort of coincidental to the main question, which is what's the international law on this, but I probably took a week and did this comparative law research to buttress my analysis. Now someone is going to go off and write a whole PhD about the domestic law, comparative law aspect, and when they do, then or someone else won't need to repeat what I did.
Yes.
But this is what we do, and professors are fortunate in that no one's checking up on what we're doing. We can be down a rabbit hole into the the state law of Vermont, and no one can tell us to stop.
And is this what takes you into legal history in the same way that you were talking about earlier, or is there less historical aspect than comparative aspect?
One of the things I'm very interested in, is the origins and the development of legal systems, and with that, the actual making and changing of law. And I'm both a political scientist and a lawyer, so I'm interested in, by politics, I'm interested in disparities of power and influence. And if you take, for instance, space law, which started in 1957 when the Soviets launched Sputnik, and the rest of the world just looked at it and said, wow, instead of saying that's illegal, you can't fly over our territory. Right? The right of satellite overflight was established almost instantly by the acquiescence of every country, which was a change from airspace, right?
Yeah.
We have territorial control over airspace, but a satellite, which is only, 150 miles up, is treated completely differently. And no one knew whether there was a right of satellite overflight until that widespread acquiescence. And so we're starting in 1957. So outer space law is a very young legal system, or sub-legal system. There was a lot of activity up until 1969 and Apollo 11, and then everyone lost interest because all of the funding dried up. So there was this sort of golden age of legal development. And only now, in literally the last 3 years, has space come back in a really big way. Just to give you an example of this, in the last 3 years, the number of operational satellites in orbit has doubled. Okay, doubled. Elon Musk and SpaceX are building a spaceship that will take people to Mars. Right? This is just all now happening. And so to understand what's happening now, you have to actually go back and understand what happened between 1957 and 1969. Those years are absolutely crucial. That's just a 12-year period, and it's a 12-year pre-digital period. And it's wrapped up in the early Cold War period. It involves issues of arms control, and also the realization that nuclear weapons could annihilate civilization. It's all tied up in there. And just to give you one interesting example, in 1962, the United States military tested a nuclear warhead in low Earth orbit to see whether it would work as an anti-satellite weapon. And it worked far better than they'd expected, and took out 6 operational satellites, including Telesat 1, which was the pride and joy of the American television industry, because it was the first satellite that could beam live US television to the UK.
Right.
And this was just as the United States and the Soviet Union and France and the UK and other countries were realizing the incredible commercial and surveillance potential of satellites. And they just realized that if you use a nuclear weapon, we will all lose. Yeah. And so they sat down. And they negotiated the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty that centrally bans the testing of nuclear weapons in space. And this was, again, 1960, this is the height of the Cold War, right? And so understanding that the origins of this sub-legal system for outer space originated with 2 nuclear-armed powers that were preparing to annihilate civilization if they needed to, coming to the rational conclusion that they needed to cooperate. That's absolutely central to figuring out how we move forward today. right? I'm the first person that wants to see Vladimir Putin in the dock in The Hague. But I'm also the first person that wants the International Space Station to continue with cooperation between the Russian Space Agency and the West. And it is actually still continuing today. And you know, how do you understand what happens on the International Space Station? Well, you look at the Space Station Agreement, which is a treaty among 15 states. And believe you me, right, the Russians and the Americans are all pointing at treaty provisions to justify their continued cooperation and how they're going to manage this in the extraordinarily difficult position, where you know, that's almost the only place where we still talk to each other.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you our usual final question, and then I'm going to ask you one additional question from something that's been arising. The last question we ask about is, again, a reflective one, which is the relationship between emotion and law, and it, in a sense, follows on from what you've been saying, that there are certain areas of law which manage to take emotion out or adapt emotion so they work well. Do you think that's true, or do you think that there's a sort of mutual antagonism between law and emotion?
At the international level, I think a lot of what has happened and continues to happen is actually reason for optimism, that law between nation states is a reflection of at least some shared humanity. International lawyers tend to be optimistic, and they tend to be internationalists rather than nationalists. And that is because there is a potential to serve you know, higher purpose than just narrow state interest. And you know, I was first drawn towards international human rights for that reason. I realized that there was something quite wonderful about international human rights, because international human rights are held by individuals vis-a-vis nation states. So the right is held by an individual human being, the obligation is held by a nation state. That's really exciting, right? I mean, how did that happen? And sometimes they have consequences, right? You know, so violations of human rights, they might not necessarily save the individual human being involved, but they can have consequences, reputational consequences, sometimes even sanctions. If they actually constitute war crimes, very occasionally someone will end up in jail. And that fascinated me. I'm an anti-authoritarian personality. Bit of a rebel when I was younger, and then this was something really cool. And as I got into learning more about international law, I realized that there were other things. If you care about the environment, well, ultimately this needs to be solved at a global level. If you prefer peace over war, well, international law can help achieve that goal also. Not always, obviously, but maybe reduce the frequency or the scale of what goes on. And I love teaching international law for that reason. I teach mostly political science students, international relations students who you know, are taught all about the hard-nosed self-interest of national decision makers. I come at them with something different, right? Like how do you actually explain this? Why would the world come together and negotiate a convention against torture? And perhaps even more specifically, why would the president of Chile, a man named Augusto Pinochet, sign the act of ratification for his country, and then a decade and a half later find himself having to have lawyers in front of the House of Lords to prevent him being extradited to stand trial for torture in Spain? So you know, there's a power here, and it's a power that's not based upon military might or economic strength. It's a power based upon ideas and decisions to try to achieve a better system, a better world. One of my most important mentors my whole career, but from an early period, was Philip Allen, who was a legal philosopher at Cambridge. And he once said that law was how societies seek to control their own future. Yeah. Right. There are things that we do to ensure that in a political crisis, we don't just respond in the moment, but we actually respond in ways that we would have liked us to respond in the abstract 5, 10, 50 years ago. Right? It's a forward-looking, how can we direct wisdom into the future? It doesn't always work, but it's a pretty important invention for our species to figure out that we can actually, to some degree, control the future by writing agreed things down.
This leads directly to what my additional question was to you, which is, as you know, the project is interested in law and how lawyers think and shared ideas, shared languages. You've repeatedly said you're both international lawyer and political scientist. Do you think and talk in different ways in those roles, or is it that simply that you are institutionally both?
I'm increasingly skeptical of the academic silos that we call disciplines. And I think that to actually develop understanding and to find workable solutions, one needs to break out of those silos. And you know, I wrote a PhD thesis at Cambridge about the role of power in the making and changing of customary international law, thinking I was doing legal research, until I started reading the international relations literature that was trying to answer some of the same questions, but from the other side of a pretty thick wall.
Yeah.
I actually teach in the political science department now at the University of British Columbia, partly because I wanted to have the opportunity for different perspectives. But as a result, I'm giving up, I suppose, the benefits of being part of a fairly small group of reinforcing scholars who kind of chart the central path of their discipline. There are certain benefits to that. No, I'm reaching out, and my rewards are, as I said, in terms of trying to identify new issues and to some degree influence the direction of events internationally. It's just a different path, but to do what I do, one can't think about law as a discipline. Law is it's a social reality, but it's also something that can be that can be activated to achieve change, and that's the real wonderful sort of turn here. Is the same thing that gives us stability into the future, enables us to challenge those who would like to act precipitously, to do the politically expedient thing. And in those moments, right, when a national leader or an international organization wants to do something, and you can interject into that conversation, hang on a second, your predecessors decades ago, in a period of relative objectiveness, decided that actually no, you should do something else. When you're talking about a treaty or you're talking about state practice, that's what you're doing. You're using the law to do what it's supposed to do, which is to control society's future. I don't want to in any way suggest that this is a particularly grandiose exercise, or that my success rate is very good. It's not, and even if it was, you can't establish causation for these kinds of developments. I'm just doing what I can, and from time to time, hopefully, making some thoughtful person, and sometimes these people are elected politicians, go, hang on a second, that's not what my advisor said.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes it's just that. Oh, this professor here said something that contradicts what my advisor said. I better get my advisors back in here so they can explain this to me again. That's a victory for the activist, right there.
Thank you. That has been fascinating and inspiring. Tremendous.
Well, thank you. I have to say, one doesn't usually think about these aspects of one's life. They just happen. So thank you.
Thank you.